Well, before we move to chapter 4, as I indicated last time, I'd like to take some time out in this session and talk about some history associated with the time that Lamentations is around the time, at least, that Lamentations is speaking about. And for the most part, I'm going to be looking at 2 Kings, 2 Kings. I wouldn't want to call it 2 Kings and get accused of that. 2 Kings 23 through 25. About 3 chapters there that deal with the events in Israel about that time, before that time, actually, maybe as much as 30, 40 years before that time, then down through the exile time. And when I say exile time, actually there are multiple exile periods, and we'll talk about that. So, we're going to get there now. We're going to take a look at this history and see how it relates or how it informs us maybe a bit more about what was happening in Lamentations. The drama that played out began about the time of Josiah's kingship. Josiah was the last good king of Judah. The northern kingdom, Israel, never had a good king. So Josiah was the last of the good kings, period. As a matter of fact, it said that he may have been the one that followed Yahweh the best of all kings, including David. So in some respects, he's ranked right up there with David. And this was in the late 600s BC. And in the history involved that we're going to look at, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, and Judah as the major players. There will be some other players in there, but those 4 are the predominant ones. And Assyria was just simply involved early and then not. I don't know how much you know about the history of that time, but Assyria had for decades been the major power in the region. Before Assyria, it was Egypt. And then there was the potential that a combination of Egypt and Assyria would outstrip Babylon's rise to power. Turns out that never happened, however. So, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, the bad guys, Judah, the good guys, supposedly. So, for a long while, as I mentioned, Assyria had been the dominant power in the region, and when Syria rose, then Egypt fell to second. Didn't stop Egypt from trying to maintain number 1 in the region, but it couldn't keep up with Assyria. But then, all of a sudden, there were some civil wars taking place in Assyria, and that began to weaken Assyria as a major power. An Assyrian, by the way, named Nabopolassar, Nabopolassar, became a leader in Babylon. Then he became Babylon's king, and he ascended onto the scene with influence and power, and it was at that time that Babylon began to rise in terms of structure of the power in the Middle East. Nebuchadnezzar became the king in 605 BC. I think Nabopolassar was probably before 609 BC. So several years after Nabopolassar came Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king of Babylon during most of the time that we're going to speak about. In 605 BC, by the way, that is a key first date for us with respect to Lamentations. It was the first siege and entering Jerusalem by Babylon, and the first exile. This was the time when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go, ended up going to Babylon. So this was the first exile to Babylon, 605 BC. And in that year, Nebuchadnezzar defeated Necho of Egypt. Judah, which had been a vassal state of Egypt, then became a vassal state of Babylon. Remember, Necho is the one who was going up to join Assyria in a coalition, and Josiah inadvisedly stepped out to stop Necho, and in the process Josiah was killed by Necho's forces. So that's where this thing then begins. If we go back and look at the kings of that region, most of it is on a downward path. It started with Manasseh, who was probably the most evil king of all of Judah's kings. Then his son Ammon, then Josiah. And Josiah, as I said, while he comes of this lineage from Manasseh, and Ammon was actually a good king. He got to be a king at a child's age, but when he found out that the book of the law had been found, he started reforms and followed Yahweh very closely. I'm going to back up to 2 Kings 23. We're going to look at material from 2 Kings 23, 24, and 25. So now I want to look at 23 verses 25 through 27. And it starts this way. And before him, that him in this case was Josiah, there was no king like him. In other words, there was no king that matched Josiah's following Yahweh like he did, even David. And it goes on, says this, no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So even to today, Josiah in some respects is considered to have been Judah's best king, and the best king of all in Israel, whether it's the northern kingdom, the Judean kingdom, or the undivided kingdom. Didn't matter. He stands above all the rest, apparently, in terms of his devotion to Yahweh. But then let's go to verse 26. However, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, with which his anger burned against Judah, because of Manasseh, Ammon, some before, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him, Yahweh. And the Lord and Yahweh said, I will remove Judah also from my sight, as I have removed Israel. 150 years earlier, 722 BC, Assyria demolished the northern kingdom, Israel. And Israel, the northern kingdom, never again became a nation. So it was essentially wiped off the map. There are descendants from the northern kingdom, but they're not in the northern kingdom anymore. It simply doesn't exist. It was wiped off the face of the earth as far as a functioning nation is concerned. And Yahweh continues, I will cast off Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen, and the temple of which I said, my name shall be there. So here, back in 2 Kings 23, we see that because of the work of Manasseh, and which actually included everyone, the nation itself of Judah, in their sins, their breaking of the covenant, God said, I'm going to remove Judah from my side. I'm going to stop Judah from being a nation really functioning, and I'm going to cast off Jerusalem. So there are the prophecies that set up what we see in Lamentations. You see it in Isaiah, you see it in Jeremiah, and to some extent in Ezekiel. So, but anyhow, it goes all the way back to the time when Josiah is now dead. And when that happened, God looked forward and said, I got to do something here. Judah is not behaving as my covenant nation. After Josiah, the king, was his son Jehoahaz. Let's read about Joahaz in, again, 2 Kings 23, verses 31, 32, and 33. Joahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Short term. He's not the only one. There's going to be one later who also served only 3 months. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Never mind who his pop was. He was not in the same league as Josiah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers gone through. Ammon and what was the guy's name? I lose track of it. Manasseh, yeah. Ammon and Manasseh. To all that they had done. In other words, he was doing the same things that those evil kings were. And Pharaoh Necho, there we go again. Egypt is still having some power in the region. Pharaoh Necho imprisoned him at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. So Necho says, I'm not having any part of this guy. Get him out of there. And he, Necho, imposed on the land a fine of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Well, who followed Jehoahaz? It was a guy by the name of Eliakim. Eliakim. Why do I bother to spell out? Because that's not the name you're going to know him by in most cases. Let's go to 2 Kings 23, verses 34 through 37. And Pharaoh Necho, remember, he booted out Josiah's son, made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, is another son of Josiah, king, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. So when you read, you'll probably run into the name Jehoiakim far more often than Eliakim. Eliakim was his born name. Jehoiakim is his palace name. But notice, where did that name come from? Pharaoh Necho. When in those days, if you change someone's name, it meant you owned him. He was telling Jehoiakim, you and Judah belong to me. So they were a vassal state under Egypt. But he took Joahaz away, who had been king. He was the king voted by the people. But Necho said, no, I don't care. Get him out of there. We're going to bring in Jehoiakim. And he brought him to Egypt, and he died there. So Jehoiakim gave the silver and gold to Pharaoh. That was what Pharaoh had demanded as a tribute. But he taxed the land in order to give the money at the command of Pharaoh. So the people are the ones who are going to pay the tribute. Jehoiakim's not going to do it. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. So now Jehoiakim's going to last a while. But in verse 37, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He was not a good king. And so let's go now to chapter 24 of 2 Kings, the first 3 verses. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up. And this was at 605 BC. And Jehoiakim became his servant. Because remember, 4 years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar had dealt with Necho and Egypt. So now they are, because Nebuchadnezzar wanted it, he came up and made sure that Israel was a vassal state of Babylon. For 3 years, Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He said, I'm not paying anymore. Got smart with him. And the Lord sent against him bands of Chaldeans, that would be the Babylonians, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, bands of Ammonites. So 4 groups of armed warriors led by the led by the Babylonians, set against Judah, or Judea, whichever you prefer. And they came against Judah in order to destroy it, according to the word that God had given earlier back in 2 Kings 23. Remember, he said, I'm going to wipe Judah out of my memory for the time being, out of my mind at least, and Jerusalem is going to be toppled, which he had spoken through his servants the prophets. So this was prophesied to the people, and now it has begun in 605 BC. Surely at the command of Yahweh it came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that Manasseh had done. Well, who follows Jehoiakim? You can bet that he's not going to remain king when he's refusing to pay Nebuchadnezzar. So we're going to someone called Jehoiachin, or Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin. I believe it would be Jehoiakim. But it's also given in Scripture in various places as Jeconiah and as Coniah. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up. This was at 605 BC. And Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned. Remember, Jehoiakim was in as king for 11 years. So after a while, he was serving and paying not to Necho in Egypt anymore, but to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. He was paying tribute. But for 3 years after he started with Babylon, he turned and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, said, I'm not paying you anymore. And the Lord sent against Jehoiakim bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites. So 3 local nation groups in the region sided with Babylon, the Chaldeans, in order to take out Jehoiakim. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of Yahweh. Remember, he had said back in chapter 23 of 2 Kings, I'm going to do this, which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. Surely at the command of the Lord it came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done. Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, also in Scripture called Jeconiah, and also in Scripture called Coniah, became king. Let's read about that in verses 6 to 9 of 2 Kings 24. So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, became king. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Nehushta. I don't know if that name Nehushta rings any bells with you. It does with me, because it's very close to the name of the brass serpent that Moses put on a pole, so that people, when bit by serpents, could look to the serpent on the pole and not die. It's Nehushtan, and it became an idol of worship in the temple at one point. So, but her name, Jehoiakim's mother's name, is very similar to that serpent, brass serpent's name. And he, Jehoiakim, did evil in the sight of the Lord. Remember, in this whole list, only Josiah followed the Lord. And if we move down to verse 10 through 15, we see this. At that time, Jehoiakim, because of Nebuchadnezzar, was deported in 597. This is the second major date. First one's 605, the second one's 597. There was again a siege of Jerusalem, a taking of Jerusalem, and an exile of people from Jerusalem. So the people in Jerusalem are dwindling in numbers by these exiles. And then it continues, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, too many syllables again, folks, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege, just what I mentioned a minute ago. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city, and Jehoiakim, king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon. So Jehoiakim goes out to Nebuchadnezzar. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. This is Jehoiakim. And he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord. So he took anything that was gold or even brass, I guess, and removed it from the temple and took it and put in a pagan temple in Babylon, just as the Lord had said would happen. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem. So he led Jehoiakim away into exile to Babylon. So now there's no king again. So how are they going to get a king? Well, that's coming up. Nebuchadnezzar, remember, had defeated Egypt in 609 BC. The first siege in 605 BC sent the first exiles to Babylon, and here 8 years later in 597 BC there's another siege, another entry of Jerusalem, and another exile. So that's the second siege, second entry, second exile. Now, the next king, and this guy technically is not going to be considered a king. Well, maybe he was. He didn't belong. 2 Kings 24, verses 17, 18, and 19. Then the king of Babylon made his, that's Joachim's uncle, Mattaniah, king in his place, and, as he did with Jehoiakim, changed his name to Zedekiah. So now Zedekiah is king at the request and insistence of Nebuchadnezzar, and so Zedekiah is a vassal of Babylon. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And I think that's after about 8 years he rebelled. So, what do we have? The gold Babylon took from the temple was repositioned in a pagan temple in Babylon. In 597 BC, the second siege of Jerusalem also sent exiles to Babylon, including the king Jehoiakim. Zedekiah's rebellion, though, after 8 years, I think it was, but I'm not sure. I think it was after about 8 years, resulted in the third siege of Jerusalem in 587 or 586 BC. This siege was going to last for 2 years, and it's going to have the total destruction of Jerusalem, the total destruction of the temple, and further exile. So this is number 3 in terms of siege, entry, exile to Babylon. 2 Kings 25, moving right along, verses 6 through 11. Then they, the Babylonians, captured the king Zedekiah, who had tried to get out and sneak out between in a gate that was between 2 walls of Jerusalem. He tried to sneak out at night, but they caught him. And they brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And he that would be Nebuchadnezzar, passed sentence on Zedekiah. And they slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and then put out the eyes of Zedekiah. So the last thing Zedekiah saw was the execution of his sons, and then he saw absolutely nothing after that. They bound him with bronze fetters and brought him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of the king of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burnt the house of the Lord. He burned and destroyed the temple, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every great house he burned with fire. So he is the one responsible for leading the total destruction of the city. So all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. And by the way, you remember about the walls of Jerusalem. They were torn down completely. How badly was it? It was so bad that when Nehemiah rebuilt the wall, he couldn't rebuild it in the old spot. He had to move the wall inward towards the middle of the city a bit. I don't remember exactly how far that was. It was so bad that he couldn't rebuild the wall where it had been before. I don't know that that's mentioned in Nehemiah's work, but they have discovered that it was moved. Then the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, and the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away into exile. So what do you have left in Jerusalem? Total destruction. No food. Nothing's left. But evidently there were a few of the poor who weren't. Babylon says, we don't want to take them. We're going to have to care for them. They're not able to care for themselves. They're not high up in the uppity ranks. They're not the type we want in our government. So we'll leave the bottom tier of people, in some sense, in Jerusalem. So there are very few people left. So it looks very desolate, but there is some life. But they were not capable people for the most part. So there you have it. Over 20 years of war and subservience to Babylon. 3 sieges, 605 BC, 597 BC, 586 BC. 3 sets of exiles, 3 sieges of Jerusalem. Jerusalem and the temple are totally destroyed. The city is left in ruins, almost vacant. So that's the scene into which Lamentations speaks. But there's yet one more detail I want to give you some time to think about. At least I find it of interest, and so do some other people. The last descendant of David to sit on David's throne. I'm going to give you his name. We're going to move to 1 Chronicles 3, 15 and 16. 1 Chronicles 3:15 and 16. And the sons of Josiah were Johanan the firstborn, and the second Jehoiakim, and third Zedekiah. He was not the same Zedekiah who was made king, by the way. The fourth is Shallum. The sons of Jehoiakim were Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim, or Coniah, his son. What about this guy, Jeconiah? I'm going to ignore Zedekiah for the minute and go directly to Jeconiah, Jehoiakim, or Coniah, take your pick. I'm going to go to Jeremiah 22, verses 28, 29, and 30, where we find Yahweh speaking through Jeremiah. And he asks a question. Yahweh asks a question. Is this man Coniah a despised, shattered jar? Or is he an undesirable vessel? Why have he and his descendants been hurled out and cast into a land they had not known, taken to Babylon, of course? O land, 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 hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, write this man down, that's Coniah, write Coniah down as childless, a man who will not prosper in his days, for no man of Coniah's descendants will prosper sitting on the throne of David, or ruling again in Judah. No descendant, and you can throw Zedekiah in there if you want, no descendant of Coniah, Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim, no son of or male descendant of that man will ever sit on the throne of David. So, who do you know to be a descendant of Coniah? I'm not going to tell you, but I'm going to ask you to look at Matthew's genealogy in chapter 1 of the Gospel. Matthew chapter 1. Look at the genealogy in there and see who is a descendant of Coniah. Then think why the virgin birth of Jesus was so important to Christianity. Next session, I'm going to go back to Lamentations and begin chapter 4, which will turn back to the dark side, and there'll be some flickers of hope, but it's going to go back to the dark side. But do the homework that I've asked you to do. Look at that and see who was not qualified to sit on David's throne because of God's statement in